this is Andrea Kane, and I'm here with you for HSC 114 Medical Terminology, where we are studying the Language of Medicine 12th edition by Davy Allen Jabner. This week is week 4, and we have moved on to chapter 7, the urinary system. If you take a look at your syllabus, you'll see that we are focusing on unit objectives 9.3.1 through 9.3.9. All right. If you'd like to follow along in your book, we are on page 203. Our chapter goals are very similar to our other body system chapters, where we want to look at the organs that are in that specific system, the locations, functions, talk about common pathological conditions, talk about the diagnostic tests that are involved, look at combining forms, prefixes, and suffixes, look at clinical procedures, lab tests, and abbreviations, and understand medical terms in their context. And in this particular chapter, we want to talk about urinalysis, how it's used and interpreted as a diagnostic test. All right then, let's get started. If you turn to page 204 at the beginning, it talks about nitrogenous wastes. Nitrogenous wastes. Those are made up of urea, creatinine, and uric acid. When foods containing proteins are used by cells in the body, nitrogenous waste products, meaning urea, creatinine, and uric acid, are released into the bloodstream. The urinary system then removes these wastes from the blood so that they don't accumulate and become harmful. As blood passes through the kidneys filter these wastes to form urine, and urine is made up of water, salts, and acids. Urine then leaves the body through the ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. Every day, the kidneys process out about 200 quarts of blood to filter out 2 quarts of urine. Isn't that amazing when you think about it? Your little kidneys and my little kidneys are filtering 200 quarts of blood every day, and out of that are forming around 2 quarts of urine. So you can see why they say drink lots of water and those types of things, because it's needed to be able for the kidneys to be able to function properly. And that kind of leads us into the next one. Your body needs to maintain the proper balance of water, electrolytes, and acids, and your kidneys help you do that through their filtration process. Electrolytes are made up of sodium and potassium, and these small molecules conduct an electrical charge. They're necessary for making sure your muscles and nerve cells function properly. Okay? A couple of other things that the kidneys do is they release hormones. They release renin, which is an enzyme important in adjusting blood pressure. They release erythropoietin, EPO. It's a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production in the bone marrow. They also release calciferol. This is an active form of vitamin D that's necessary for the absorption of calcium from the intestine. You'll often hear about people with osteoporosis who need to take vitamin D. The reason for that is that this vitamin D works to absorb the calcium and put it back into the bones. And then your kidneys also degrade and eliminate hormones from the bloodstream that need to be eliminated. So if you look on page 205 in your book, you'll see figure 7.1. And I'll bring this up here as well. This is the male urinary system, and it's going to show you all of the different parts to it. On this previous slide, it talked about how the urinary system is made up of your kidneys, urinary bladder, and urethra. Even though we're talking about the male urinary system here, if we jump ahead, you'll see the exact same organs in the female urinary system. They're just expressed differently. And we'll show you the figures for both of those. So whether it's male or female urinary system, you have kidneys, ureter, urinary bladder, urethra. And you have 2 ureters, by the way. All right, so you can see here, Your kidneys are these kidney-shaped organs up here. Sitting on top of your kidneys is your adrenal gland, and we'll talk more about your adrenal gland in a couple of chapters ahead, but just know that they kind of perch here on the top of the kidney. Your kidney is made up of two parts. It has an outer cortex and an inner medulla, and we'll define what each of those do. Then you have your ureters, and they come down. You have a ureter with each kidney, and they empty into the urinary bladder. From the bladder, you have one urethra, and that leads to the external part of the body. So in a male, it leads to the penis, and in the female, as you can see here, it leads to the urinary meatus, which is where the urine is released. So you can see in the female, you've got your kidneys here, and you've got your little adrenal glands perched on top. You have two ureters, one with each kidney. They come down here to the urinary bladder, which hides right here behind the vagina in a female. And in that urinary bladder, you have one little urethra here at the bottom that leads to the external orifice of the body. All right, so again, the same organs, just expressed differently. And in both cases, I wanted you to look at and note the fact that there is a major artery here and there's blood supply happening. And the blood supply goes to the kidneys. Because remember, the kidneys are filtering blood. So if we go back and we look at the same thing, you've got your aorta and your large vein, and they're coming down here, and you've got your renal veins and renal arteries going in, so you had that blood filtration. All right, so what is voiding? What does the term voiding mean? Well, we know it's not the outer section of the kidney because we talked about that being called the cortex. And we talked about nitrogenous wastes. So you're down to B and D. Which one is it? I know you can get this. All right, how do kidneys produce urine? This is starts on page 206 and goes into page 207. Essentially, the blood enters the kidneys through the right and left renal arteries. Remember, arteries are pushing blood out from the heart to the body. It's oxygenated blood that's coming out and being pushed out. Arteries then become arterioles. Arterioles are like mini arteries. They carry blood to the capillaries. And at the capillary level, there's an exchange. And the blood is filtered at that point through glomeruli. And there's pictures of this, and I'm sure we'll get to them as we go through. In fact, here we go. Okay, so let's talk through that again. You have your renal artery where this oxygenated blood is coming in, and it's in the red. And it gets into these little arterioles at the very end. See? These are little arterioles. And at the ends of the arterioles are these little itty bitty, they almost look like dots, red dots. Those are the glomeruli. And that's where the filtration is actually happening. And you can read more about this in your book. It'll talk through about how the blood passes through many glomeruli. The thin walls of each glomerulus permit water, salts, sugar, and urea with other nitrogenous wastes such as creatinine and uric acid to leave the bloodstream. These materials collect in a tiny cup-like structure called a glomerular capsule, also known as Bowman's capsule. That surrounds each glomerulus. And then the walls of the glomeruli prevent large substances, because this depends on molecule size, such as proteins and blood cells from filtering into the urine. They keep them out. These substances remain in the blood and normally do not appear in urine. So that kind of tells you how. And so this is talking about how the blood passes through those itty bitty glomeruli that's surrounded by the Bowman capsule, and then you have the attachment. So here's a picture of that. All right, we were talking about how the arterioles, the blood comes in, an afferent one, so that means coming in. Efferent means leaving. So it comes in here, and this is this glomeruli, or glomerulus, where this is happening. And this structure here is your Bowman capsule. And you see this exchange where it's filtering out, pulling out sugar, water, urea, and waste, and salts. They're getting pulled out at this point. And then what's left heads back out and goes back into the blood system. And there's more to it than this, but this is the very beginning of the process. This is step one in the filtration process. And as I mentioned, there are 3 steps. You have the glomerular filtration, then you have a tubular reabsorption and a tubular secretion. The tubular reabsorption is called proximal tubular reabsorption, and the tubular secretion is distal, meaning at the far end. So the next step is that proximal tubular reabsorption. And if we look at our book and we look at our visual here, we're still on page 207 in case you're wondering. Okay, so we talked about the arteriole, how the blood's coming in. We talked about how we have the glomeruli and the Bowman capsule where we're pulling out the water, the sugar, the waste, the salt. And then what's left is the blood keeps on going. It leaves that Bowman capsule. But it's still here paralleling the structure, the renal tubule. And at this point, it's called the proximal tubular reabsorption. Again, in the urine, it's going to push things back out. Usually water, sugar, and some salts. Going to push them back out. You have another set of capillaries, and then you have the distal tubular secretion. And things that are in here get pushed back into the urine. Acids, potassium, and drugs. And from here, the yellow is urine, because you're making urine all the way along this yellow process. You're making urine. The first part is that filtration. Then there's reabsorption, where you're so the filtration is you're pulling out water, sugars, waste, and salts. A little bit further along, you need to do some reabsorption, where you're pushing some things back into the bloodstream, because remember, you're talking about electrolytes and keeping those balanced. And then as you go along the renal tubule, you get to the secretion point where there are some things that need to go back into the urine. Acids, potassium, and drugs, and those get secreted back into the urine. And then it finishes off, and you've now produced urine. And that's 95% water, 5% waste, and those wastes include urea and creatinine, plus there are some salts, some acids, and some drugs, depending on the individual. All right, and then of course you've got your purified or cleaned blood that continues on through your veins back to your heart, where it's pushed to the lungs, where it's oxygenated, pushed back to the heart, and then it goes back out through your arteries, and the process starts over. But what you need to really know from this is glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, tubular secretion, and what happens with all of that, what those are. The glomerulus and a renal tubule combine to form a unit called a nephron. So this is one nephron. Okay, this right here, this process, this is one nephron because it's one Bowman capsule and one renal tubule. How many nephrons do you think you have in your body? How many? Pop quiz. Because your book does tell you that. It's at the bottom of page 207. How many nephrons do you have? Do you realize you have close to 1 million nephrons? Close to 1 million. It's just amazing. All right, so this is also on top of page 207, so figure 7.4, and this is, again, essentially one nephron, and you have 1 million of those. Oh, and I anticipated the next question. Sorry about that, but I guess you could get the right answer. All right, collecting tubules then lead to the renal pelvis. There are calyx. It's easier for me to just say calyx, calyces, but you have these calyxes. They are small cup-like regions of the renal pelvis. The term comes from the Greek, meaning a cup or a case surrounding a flower bud. And you can see why they would call it that. Okay, these are your calyxes or calyxes. And then they have the renal pelvis here that leads to the ureter. And remember, each kidney has one ureter. It has its own. So we talked about how the functions of the kidneys were to remove nitrogenous waste, balance water and electrolytes, release hormones, and then degrade and eliminate the hormones that need that to happen to them. So let's take a look at this visual, and this is on page 208 in your book. We talked about the bloodstream. So you've got your blood coming in through that renal arteriole to the glomerulus, where the filtration happens. Water, sugar, salt, urea are pulled out when it's filtered. Then inside the glomerular capsule, you move to the point where your capsule is within the renal tubule. First you have reabsorption. Reabsorption happens where some water, sugar, and salts are pulled back out and put in the bloodstream because they are needed for that homeostasis, that electrolyte balance. Then you have at the very end, you have secretion, where some of these are pushed back into the urine. And from there, in your renal tubule, at that point, you are now producing urine. It's urea and waste, salts, water, acids, and drugs. Those go through the renal pelvis to the ureter to be dumped into the bladder. And the bladder has both kidney ureters coming down into it. So the bladder is like a holding tank. And then your urethra is sort of like a hose from that holding tank to get rid of the urine, to move it to the outside of the body through whatever means that is. All right, so let's move on to vocabulary. Arterial, calyx or calyx, however you want to, there are two different spellings here. And calyxes or calyxes is the plural. Catheter, cortex, creatinine, electrolyte. Erythropoietin, filtration, glomerular capsule, glomerulus, hilum. Kidney, meatus, medulla, nephron. Nitrogenous waste, potassium, reabsorption, renal artery. Renal pelvis, renal tubules, renal vein. Renin, sodium. Trigon. Urea, ureter, urethra, uric acid, urinary bladder, urination, which is the same as voiding, expelling urine, also called micturition. All right, let's talk some combining forms. You have calio and calico. Notice that. You've got two there for that. Cysto, glomerulo, meato. Nephro, pylo, reno, trigono. Uretero, urethro, vesico. Albumino, azoto, bacterio, dipso. Calo or calo, depending on how it's used. Keto, ketono. Litho, natro, nocto, oligo. Now let's talk about some suffixes that are mixed in with combining forms. Not sure why they did it this way, but they give us a few of both. Poetin, pio, tripsy, euro, urea, urino. And now we have moved on. We're to page 216. Some tests that are included in a urinalysis include color, appearance, pH, and protein. And your book does a really good job of explaining these. And then there's more on the next page. There's glucose, specific gravity, ketone bodies, sediment and cast, phenylketonuria, or PKU, bilirubin. So there's those 10. Now let me flip to the next page. Those 10 tests that are included in a urinalysis, or can be. Like I said, I'm going to defer to your book so you can read through those. You really just need to know the terms and how they're spelled and hopefully what they mean. Quick quiz. In a urinalysis, what does the test of specific gravity reflect? That's number 6 out of 10. So I'm going to let you take a look at that. But think about that. Think about gravity. What does gravity do? And why does it talk about gravity? The heaviness. And hopefully I haven't just given that away. All right. So moving on to pathologic conditions. What can go wrong with the urinary system? Well, let's talk about your kidneys. You're talking about 1,000,000 nephrons. Can anything go wrong with 1,000,000 of something? Absolutely. You have glomerulonephritis, inflammation of that glomerulus, interstitial nephritis, nephrolithiasis. You remember lithy from the last one? It meant stones. Yes, kidney stones. Many people suffer, and the word suffer is true, with kidney stones. They're incredibly painful and they take a while to pass. There are procedures to break those up, and we'll probably talk about that when we get a little bit further in. But nephrolithiasis is a very painful condition, meaning kidney stones. Nephrotic syndrome, that's also talked about in your book. Polycystic kidney disease. This is where the kidneys develop all these cysts, and cysts are a fluid-filled sac. If you're looking at this, you can see this is not going to be a normal functioning kidney. With all these sacs of fluid, it's not going to function normally. And it says here that they weigh 20 times more than their usual weight. You can imagine the stress this is putting on the body when it comes to this. And you can imagine that this can cause your kidneys to not function, right? So it could be very serious. Pyelonephritis is a very common one that I see in hospitals. Renal cell carcinoma, absolutely. When it comes to any type of cells, you can have carcinoma. Renal failure, renal hypertension, because remember, we're talking about blood and blood pressure. Because you're filtering things out. And so when you're talking about when your kidneys fail, when you have renal failure and people end up on dialysis, you can see how serious it is. When your kidneys do so much for your body and then they fail, it really affects the body very badly, very quickly. So that's where you move into renal dialysis. And just so you know, renal dialysis is not used until you reach the point of end-stage kidney disease or complete renal failure. That's when they really start getting the dialysis involved. And there are a couple of different types of dialysis, and I think we'll talk about that too. So I'm not going to get too far into it here. And then there's something called a Wilms tumor. This is a malignant kidney tumor. And this gives us a picture of renal cell carcinoma within a kidney that's been removed. There's obviously bladder cancer. And then there's diabetes. There's 2 types of diabetes. Most people know about diabetes mellitus, but there's also diabetes insipidus. And we will talk about these when we get to the endocrine chapter in several weeks. A term that means frequent urination at night. Frequent at night. So look for urine and then look for something that might mean night. And that will help you find this one. All right, lab tests. Very common lab test, BUN. It's ordered on almost every patient that ends up coming in where they think there might be something off with the kidneys. So blood urea nitrogen, BUN. Creatinine clearance test is also very common. And then, of course, there are a slew of radiology tests that can be performed. As you can see here, it ranges from x-ray studies to CTs to angiography. Obviously, some things are using contrast to take a look at how things are flowing. You have voiding, where they're watching actually how your bladder is voiding, how it's working. CT, where you can take a look and identify. It can even show you that cyst on the kidney. This is a voiding cystourethrogram with contrast. And you can see they're watching it to make sure that there's not there's not an obstruction. That's what they're really looking for. Is there an obstruction? Is there a reason why this individual, this woman, might be having problems voiding? And then, of course, there's ultrasound. There are nuclear medicine tests using a radioisotope scan. MRIs can be used. And then these are a little more invasive in some ways. You have cystoscopy, where they're going in and scoping. Dialysis, obviously, they're filtering the blood. Lithotripsy, that's where they're going in and using sound waves to break up those stones so that they can be passed. Renal angioplasty, going in just like you would with any other artery or vein to see if that's something that needs to be opened up, if there's a blockage there. Doing a biopsy. There are kidney transplants. They are one of the most common transplants that are done. And then urinary catheterization, where they're putting in a catheter because they don't want the individual to be voiding, or the individual is incontinent, and they're using the catheter so that the person doesn't soil themselves. And this shows us a visual of a cystoscopy with a male going in with a cystoscope into the bladder to look around. This is a visual of hemodialysis, one of the types of dialysis. There's also peritoneal dialysis, but this is hemodialysis, where they're hooked up and the machine is filtering the blood for the individual because the individual's kidneys can no longer do it for them. And this is peritoneal dialysis. They're also hooked up, but it's using the peritoneal cavity and a solution and doing some filtration. All right, abbreviations. ADH is a common one. AKI and ARF are common, but they have moved away from ARF because ARF can stand for acute respiratory failure or acute renal failure. So they've really moved away from ARF, meaning acute renal failure. They're now using acute renal injury, that sort of thing. BUN is very common. Cath for catheter. I have seen CAPD used sometimes, as well as CCPD, but they're very rare, and typically you've got to be working in those in that area to be using those. CKD is very common. Let's see what else. Yeah, in surgery they'll talk about doing a cysto on a patient. ESRD, end-stage renal disease, is very common. ESWL, that's the extracorporeal shock wave lithotripsy, where they're using those waves to break up those kidney stones. HD for hemodialysis. Again, if you work in a dialysis unit, you'll see that very used commonly. IVP is often used. So is KUB. especially if you're in the radiology department. pH, you definitely need to know what pH stands for, the degree of acidity or alkalinity, whether it's acid or base. PKD, you may hear of, although I thought that was PKU. I'm going to argue that this is a slide error and that this one should be PKU, not PKD. I think that's an error on the slide by the publisher. UA for urinalysis, oh, that's very, very common. So you want to know UA and UTI. Again, if you're working in radiology, you'll probably see VCUG commonly used. The abbreviation RP is associated with which of the following? That might be a tough one. I will tell you that RP stands for retrograde pilogram, and this is on the top of page 221. So that might help you work this one out. All right, combining forms: albumino, angio, azoto, bacterio, calio or calico, cysto, dipso, glomerulo, glycoso, remember we had sugar, hydro, isho, kalo, keto, ketono, 2 there, litho, mieto, natro, necro, nephro, nacto, oligo, pio, pialo, reno, trigono, uro, uretero, urethro, urino, vesico, or vesico. It just really depends on how you're doing it. Some suffixes to be aware of: actasis, actemy, emia, esis, gram, lithiasis. Anytime you see lith, think stone. Lithotomy, lysis, megaly, osis, pathy. Plasty, poietin, ptosis, rhea, sclerosis, stomy. Tomy, trypsyuria. A few prefixes: a and an, anti, dia, dis, n, peri, poly, retro. Combining form: dipso. Dipso means, a good way to remember this one is if you're thirsty, you might want to dip a cup of water out of a well. Dipso, thirst. Which combining form means pus? Pus. Make sure you know this one because unfortunately it's used in multiple chapters. Combining form isho means, well, if you're not sure, go back and take a look. All right, that's it for chapter 7. Have a fabulous rest of week 4, and I'll be back in week 5. We'll be talking about chapters 8 and 9, and take care.